Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paul Lewis with the Eno Center for Transportation. Thank you for joining us today on our webinar, where we're going to be talking about what is next for mobility on demand, specifically looking at lessons from Los Angeles's mobility on demand pilot during COVID. For those that have been following Eno and our work on this project over the last several years, we've been following this very closely. And as you recall, in January of 2019, LA Metro launched a first mile, last mile, mobility on demand service with Via, a company that provides the technical and other logistics services for this service, offering shared rides to and from select rail transit stations. LA Metro and their partner research team, which included Eno, University of Los Angeles, University of Oregon, and University of Washington, evaluated some robust data on this pilot. And we published a bunch of research reports that you can download on our website, looking at the first year of the pilot and looking at issues such as data sharing and contracting, integration, accessibility. But then, of course, COVID happened in March of 2020. The LA Metro in particular pivoted in their service. They suspended shared rides. They began allowing point-to-point rides, and they leveraged the drivers that they had to offer food delivery service for some customers that had difficulty accessing food banks. So in this webinar, we're really looking at that aspect, and we've invited some folks on to help explain what happened during this time and what lessons we learned from it. So I'm going to soon turn it over to two colleagues, starting first with Sean Miller. Sean is a senior transportation planner at LA Metro's Office of Extraordinary Innovation. He's also the project manager of the Mobility on Demand pilot, so we'll hear from him. And we also have Anne Brown. Anne is the assistant professor in the School of Planning, Public Policy, and Management at the University of Oregon. And so I'm going to turn it over to Sean in just a minute, but just for those on the live webinar, you can submit questions in the question function of your live webinar. We'll be getting to audience questions following the presentations. And then if you're having issues with the technology, one thing that we found works is often refreshing your browser. That can help some connectivity and other issues. And if you're still experiencing technical issues, please click the help function in the bottom left corner of your screen. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sean. He's going to pull up a few slides and describe the program, and then we'll hear from Anne here in a moment, where she'll talk through some of the data findings of the Mobility on Demand pilot.
Great, thank you, Paul. Great to be here. Thanks to everyone out there who's joining us this afternoon or morning. So Mobility on Demand at LA Metro, it was a first last mile rideshare service that provided rides to and from metro stations in 3 zones across LA County. It launched in 2019 with Via. Via was the service provider for us. And, you know, it was a great service during the first year, but really what we're talking about today is the second year and some of the pivots that we had to make. You know, during the second year, Metro's board saw that, you know, there was a lot of value in the project. It was serving a lot of rides to and from Metro stations, but shortly thereafter, the second year of the pilot was reauthorized. You know, COVID arrived and we made some, you know, pivots during that time, which I'll get into on the next slide. And then the service ultimately came to an end in January of 2021, but the service zones actually live on through our Metro Micro service, which is Metro's current on-demand rideshare service, which is currently operating in 8 zones across the county. And so serving these 3 zones that were previously served by MOD and 5 other zones. But as I mentioned, you know, the service was reauthorized for a second pilot year The first year was actually funded by FTA through the Mobility on Demand Sandbox Demonstration Grant. The second year was locally funded, and about 2 months into the second year, COVID arrived, and we were able to pivot really quickly to make some emergency service adjustments. The first one was that we suspended shared rides in support of social distancing to, improve the safety and reduce transmission of the virus. The second one is that we transitioned from a first last mile service to a point-to-point service. And what we saw is that ridership increased dramatically during that second year. We think largely due to this transition to a point-to-point service. And to give you a sense, Metro ridership early on in the pandemic for fixed route saw an immediate 70% reduction in service. When we made this pivot, we were only seeing about a 30% reduction in ridership during the second year. And in fact, by August of 2020, we were close to double the ridership that we had been seeing month to month compared to year one. And then the last one was just that we made additional areas outside of the zone boundaries available to be reached. These were essential destinations like hospitals, medical clinics, grocery stores. So you can see in this picture, the red area represents the actual service zone, and the little gray islands outside of the box were essential destinations that we were able to reach. We also unveiled this food delivery pilot, which was actually, we were approached by another independent public agency called First 5 LA, came to us and said, we have nonprofit organizations that are rolling out food distribution programs across the county. Do you have transportation resources to support these distribution efforts? And we said, well, we are experiencing a slight drop in ridership on Mobility on Demand, but we can leverage these resources to make some deliveries across the county. So in April of 2020, we launched a very small pilot with one community just west of downtown LA. They have a Best Start program, which is 14 disadvantaged communities across the county. We started in this first one, this Metro LA Best Start community, operating, serving about 10 families, 30 food insecure families per week. This pilot was authorized to expand by our board in June of 2020. We increased to serve all 14 communities, making 750 deliveries per week. And then we continued, even though the Mobility on Demand rideshare service came to an end in January of 2021, we actually relaunched a dedicated food delivery service that operated from February of 2021, and in fact just ended this month. And in May of 2022, throughout that time, we were serving all of these communities, delivering 750 plus deliveries per week. And again, that was with our operating partner VIA as well. And we'll be getting into some more of the details of the project as we go along in this session. But now I'm going to pass it back over to Paul to introduce Anne and the research work that her and the team have done on this project.
Great. Well, thanks, Sean. I'm going to get my media up here and transition over to the research side of what did we find when we evaluated these two different programs. So this research was in collaboration with Mike Manville, professor at UCLA, and then Alexandra Weber, who is now a graduate of UCLA's urban planning program. So I'm presenting on behalf of the research team across University of Oregon and UCLA. So I'm going to first present on the two different programs, first the rideshare service and then the food delivery service. And across these two services, we on the research side were interested in essentially three questions. So one was, how often and for what purposes do people use the rideshare service? What kind of trips, et cetera? We wanted to know how well do the point-to-point rideshare service and the food delivery service work from both a service quality and a cost perspective. And then we wanted to know about user satisfaction for both services. So I'm going to walk through first the rideshare service and the food delivery, and then the food delivery. To answer those three questions I just outlined, we had two different main data sources. We had trip data. So we had trip data for both the rideshare service and the food delivery data. And this included things like the time of day, the location of the trips. And then we had survey responses as well. We had two pretty small surveys of rideshare users and food delivery recipients asking about satisfaction of the services, their favorite elements, what they wanted to see changed, and then there's some differentiation between the two, like how did they pay for groceries, and then what were trip purposes for the rideshare program. So first, on the rideshare side, here's some big level statistics. As Sean alluded to, we saw a big boom in trips compared to year one. So in year one, trips were really bound to individual transit stations, where they had to originate or end around select transit stations. In year two, with point-to-point, we saw about double the number of trips, which in some ways quite surprised us, right? A lot of this travel happened in the summer right after COVID began. So you can imagine some people transitioning off of transit for feelings of safety, others just taking advantage of that point-to-point service. About 60% of all requests that we had records for were completed trips. So in some, about 150,000 trips were completed over the 1-year time period. Most of the requests that weren't completed were either because Via, the service provider, didn't offer a ride, meaning someone requested a ride and were not actually offered a trip to take, or the rider didn't accept a trip. In both cases, these had longer estimated time of arrival. So it could be that Via couldn't get a car to them in a timely fashion, or the rider said, you know what, that's too long to wait, I'm going to find an alternative method. A very small fraction of trips, I'll just 0.2%, were wheelchair accessible vehicles. That was similar to what we saw in phase one, a very, very small share of trips using wheelchair accessible vehicles, even though when we look at the LA Metro riders, as well as the county as a whole, there's a much higher share who require different ambulatory services. In the second year pilot, there are about 6,300 unique users who took the 150,000 trips. So some people took many trips, some people took just one trip, but overall 6,300 surveyed. 6,300 people served. Overall, they compare relatively similar to the county and LA Metro ridership as a whole, kind of in between those two characteristics, younger and a little bit higher income than the average LA Metro rider, but lower income than the county as a whole. So again, that middle ground. Almost all trip requests were made via an app, despite the fact that there was a customer service line available. Some comparisons, but thinking about where were trips. So Sean showed you the map of the different service areas. I'm going to show you two sets of maps. This first one shows the number of trips across space from phase one on the left to phase two. So phase one, again, this was the point-to-point service. Phase one, sorry, was the station-based service. Phase two, point-to-point. Overall, despite the fact that the scale of these trip making was quite different, so if you look at the individual scale bar, there were a lot more trips made in phase two, but the spatial patterns were generally similar. A bit more trips on kind of the outlying areas, suggesting, again, some more use of that point-to-point service. But overall, we're seeing more trips made in kind of the central area of those zones. Looking at wait time, we saw very similar wait time patterns overall. We saw longer wait times in phase two compared to phase one, but overall we were seeing longer wait times, again, in the periphery of those zones and shorter in the center areas where you can imagine there's going to be more cars, more vehicles available for travelers and therefore waiting less time. When did people hail trips? So this graph shows the time of day just aggregated across the week. So overall, the service operated from 6 a.m. to midnight, and most trips were concentrated in the afternoon period, with about 40% during the afternoon, kind of noon to 4 p.m. Time. Another quarter were during the evening peak, and another 20% were during the evening between 8 p.m. and midnight. Most people were infrequent users of the rideshare service overall. So this infographic shows different categories of users. About a quarter of people requested a trip but never actually took one. Those could be people opening up the app, looking at what this might entail, looking at wait times and saying, you know what, I'm just going to go with my regular bus. I'm going to walk. I'm going to find another way to get there. Another third took just one trip total. and the remaining took either less than one trip or 2 or more trips a month. Most people were not using this service to commute with every day or travel every day with. They were using it more to fill in the gaps or as an infrequent or periodic mode of travel. So not replacing an everyday travel for most people. Why did people use the mobility on demand rideshare service? This graph shows a variety of trip purposes. People could select multiple trip purposes. So you'll notice these do not add up to 100%. The most common reasons for using the rideshare service were commute and errands. Definitely the outliers, the most common purpose of using the mobility on demand service, followed by healthcare and then leisure and so on. So a variety of uses across the board. What do people like about the mobility on demand rideshare service? More than half people said their favorite element was that it was free. Right? So this was a free service offered to people. People really like free service. After that, people reported that it was easier than a bus or train. It had reliable service and friendly drivers. When we asked people what they wanted to see improved, it was similar to what you hear often for transit itself. So decreased waiting times, increased coverage area, and expanded operating hours were the top 3 different dimensions of service that people wanted to see improved. When we examined cost per ride, this graph shows the different costs of the different services. Sorry, the bar on the right has gotten cut off. And so what this shows is basically cost per ride over the different time period. On the right, you'll see December 2020. And the cost was overall somewhat stable. It ranged at the same time between about $15 and $35. So it did fluctuate over time for the cost of completing a single ride. So each ride is not inexpensive to complete. So the cost per ride is in gray or black, and then the cost per driver in gold. We also wanted to compare what does the service look like compared to transit. So if someone was taking the mobility on demand service versus taking transit, how does their service experience compare? So on the far right of this table, you'll see the average wait time for mobility on demand rideshare service, and each row is a different time period. So there's no service offered before 6 a.m. And then you can see AM peak, afternoon, PM peak, and PM period, the later evening. Then each of the three preceding columns are some combination of transit. So either the headway itself, so say you're standing at a bus stop, maybe your apartment door is at a bus stop, you walk out, you have no walk time, right? That's kind of the minimum wait time you could expect. The other 2 columns are half-mile and a quarter-mile wait time combined with the maximum bus wait time. So for example, that's assuming that you walk to the bus stop, you just miss a bus, and then you have to wait another 5, 9 minutes, etc. So there's some, this isn't a perfect measure, but it's an estimate to try to compare how might a user compare these different service offerings. And overall, the mobility on demand falls basically in between the time it takes to walk between a quarter and a half mile for a bus and then wait for it, with the exception of the late evening period. So in the evening between 8 p.m. and midnight, mobility on demand provided faster service than transit plus walking. And that's largely due to the longer headways for transit. Okay, shifting over to the food delivery side. We just talked about the rideshare, thinking about food delivery. There are about 30,000 food delivery trips completed over the year period and about 1,800 users. So like the rideshare service, most people did not use the delivery service that frequently. So most people, about 80%, received 1 delivery or less than 1 delivery per month. So only 20% received more than 1 delivery a month. So it's serving a lot of people, but not that often. Here's where those drop-offs were occurring. And as Sean mentioned, these were partnered with Best Start communities. And so these are very intentionally targeted towards specific communities. So you'll see a very concentrated geography of the drop-off zone. But again, just if you want to have a better understanding of where these services were being provided, this map gives you a sense of that. When we look at how people previously got to the grocery store, most people walked or took transit. And And then when you look at the time, the average time it took people one way to get to the grocery store was about 30 minutes. So a single food delivery could save a family on average about an hour. So a substantial time savings for people participating in this service. We had a pretty small sample of people who responded to a survey about satisfaction of food delivery. So keep in mind, this is only about 100 people, but of the people who responded to the survey, there was a high degree of satisfaction of the food delivery service across 6 different dimensions that we measured. So the process was easy to navigate, fit and schedule, increased feelings of safety and support, and it was a convenient way to access food. So overall, again, among the people who responded to our survey, there was a lot of support and satisfaction of the program. The cost per delivery was about $10 per delivery, so that's that black line at the bottom. You can then see the cost per driver hour and the cost per driver in the gold and the gray lines. Again, thinking about one driver maybe carrying multiple different deliveries at once. So about $10, pretty consistent across the study period per delivery. So in summary, we talked about how MOD in that second pilot year did a pretty extraordinary job in terms of delivering trips to people, so rides and also food. So about 156,000 passenger trips. Again, and these weren't shared, so these are individual trips, and 30,000 food delivery. So most people use MOD pretty infrequently. It clearly provided utility to people who were seeking alternative modes during this pandemic period. And whether these services will continue in the future is ultimately a decision up to Metro and other programs as well in terms of considering adopting similar services. And I'm looking forward to our discussion.
All right. Thank you for that, Anne. And I'm going to welcome Sean to hit the participate button and join us here for discussion. There's been a tremendous amount of questions that have come in during the presentations from both Sean and Anne. A lot of your questions are pretty specific in a great way, and we want to engage in that discussion. I will encourage folks to check out our website. We have a page dedicated to Mobility on Demand. So if you search for ENO Mobility on Demand, you should be able to pull up those research reports, get a lot of the data, kind of dive into some of the specifics of the service. And we're going to be continuing to add to that site as we're learning more about the year 2 of this pilot. But I want to zoom out a little bit, and I see a couple more questions coming in, and open it up with a question for Sean. You've been managing this project for quite a while now. You talked about how Mobility on Demand has transitioned to Metro Micro, right, which is a similar service that's running through the operations department. But reflecting on this pilot, how was it successful? How did it meet some of the standards that you and your team had for it, and where perhaps did it not meet your expectations?
Great question. I think the first success is people used it, and we saw increased use over the 2 years of the pilot, and especially when things were quite dire out there and folks needed transportation options. Year 2, the ability to be flexible, to provide additional access to places where people needed to go within the zone and outside of the zone, I think was a really critical part of the service. We saw that, I think, with the increased use. But, one way I think that ridership maybe didn't succeed in the way that we wanted it to was to see an equivalent level of use by low-income riders. So, Metro's fixed route system carried many more low-income riders than we were able to carry on MOD, but we did see a pretty dramatic increase in low-income ridership during year 2. And one of the guiding principles was to provide an equivalent level of service and an accessible service for folks who were low income, also folks with disabilities, and those who were unbanked. Another area, though, that I think we saw some success was with just the data that we were able to collect. The data sharing agreement with VIA was very robust. We think it was best in class, and that's really a tribute to our partner VIA and their willingness to share critical data with us. That said, something else we learned was that inadequate data was something that impacted our ability to fully evaluate the service. And so one area where we had inadequate data was, in fact, our TAP integration, which is our fare card. Another guiding principle of the project was to fully integrate with TAP. We were not able to accomplish that integration, which is one reason early on the service transitioned to free fares. So, we weren't fully able to understand how effective MOD was at introducing new riders to the transit system. Whereas if we would have had that data, we would have had a better picture of that. And then just the last, I think, lesson learned I want to say is that, this project really goes back several years. I think the FTA grant was released in 2016. I mean, that leadership was really critical to the success of this project and other, I think, on-demand services that are out there now. FTA had the foresight to see this as an opportunity for transit agencies. Metro's internal leadership, really saw it as something that they said, we're going to pursue this. We're going to roll out this new transit model, and we'll learn what we can learn. So I think those are just a few of the successes and the challenges that this project saw.
That's great. Thanks for that, Sean. It's been a fun ride, and you mentioned the data sharing agreement. We've detailed the data sharing agreement and how we got to the final data in a paper. Again, available on the link that we just sent around in the chat, so that you can check that out. But let me go over to Anne. Speaking of data, you had the privilege, along with your colleagues, to go through a lot of this data to really analyze and understand how people were using the service, not just physically, but then based on kind of who they were and what they were using it for. Can you just give us some insights as to some of the things that may have surprised you, or things that really stood out to you when evaluating this, and maybe some of the unexpected things?
Sure. So I think in terms of evaluating the data, I think the thing that surprises most, and especially in phase 2, was just simply how many people used it. I had the expectation, at least, that people simply would find alternative ways, or there'd be a drop off of travel more broadly. But as we know, a lot of people still had to travel during the pandemic, and so I was surprised that there was such a bump compared to year 1. But I think that speaks again to the point-to-point and the flexibility that this service provided to people. When evaluating the people themselves who are using it, one thing I just emphasize to anyone considering this research is it's really hard to answer that. It's opt-in surveys, right? We don't have data connected to the individual users themselves without a survey. So when, for example, Sound Transit in phase 1 evaluated the MOD program in Seattle, they were able to connect individuals to their Orca transit card. And so they had some sense of how often were people riding transit. Did they have a senior card? Did they have a student discount card? We didn't have that type of data. And so the only way we were able to tell who were using these trips were surveys. And especially phase 2, people are tired, people are busy. We didn't have a great survey response rate. So I would say, one thing I wish we could have done more of was getting higher survey responses to have a better sense of who were using it. And in some cases, the people who didn't respond to our survey were the people who used it the most. And so I would really love to know more about how people were using it, and especially people were using repeatedly. If it was part of, the same time, were they using it to trip chain? Tell me more about how they were using it. So some qualitative research to really ask how this affects their lives, I think would be a really interesting add-on for other study.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I'm watching some of the questions come in. A lot of people are asking about wheelchair accessible vehicles, and the pilot had accessible vehicles. Maybe Sean, you can describe a little bit about how that was structured from an accessibility standpoint, and then maybe Anne, you can pick up a little bit and talk about how there was a lower uptake, I think, than what we were expecting in terms of folks that had disabilities, but we aren't necessarily sure why. But yeah, Sean, you want to just kind of describe that real quick?
Yeah. So each zone did have one dedicated wave vehicle in it, and we didn't see many rides for wheelchair accessible vehicles. We did early on, where the first few months in year one, we're not really seeing any wave vehicle rides. We did partner with Access Services, which is a paratransit provider here in LA County. And shortly after some joint marketing with them, we did start to see an uptake in that ridership. But generally speaking, yeah, we did not reach those folks in the way that we would have liked, even though the customer experience was, I think, quite an improvement compared to Access Services. Access Services is a call a day ahead, so 24-hour notice service, whereas individuals that needed a wheelchair accessible vehicle could use the app or call up the call center and access a ride within 10 to 15 minutes. And I think we saw a relatively similar wait time, maybe a little bit more for wheelchair accessible vehicles than the non-wave rides, but it was still, compared to that 24-hour notice of Access Services, very competitive. But I don't think we were able to collect a great deal of information about why that we didn't get as much of an uptake in that ridership as we would have wanted. But
yeah, I'll just add that in terms of wait time and the share of trips accepted, it was quite similar to non-wheelchair accessible vehicles. The service simply just didn't receive many requests. And I think that gets back to one of Sean's point, thinking about outreach and access, thinking about who knows about this service and that it's available. So I will say also, we didn't ask this time in this survey, but in the phase one, we asked about a range of disabilities. So both ambulatory that require wheelchairs, but also vision impairment or blindness, hearing impairments, et cetera. And so there's a variety of other people traveling with disabilities that use the service in phase one that wouldn't necessarily be reflected in the wheelchair accessible vehicle. But again, we didn't ask about that in phase two. We just have data from phase one.
Got it. I want to pick up on something you said, Sean, related to marketing and outreach. There's actually a lot of questions coming in about how this service was marketed to folks. How do they know that it existed, both the point-to-point and the food delivery? You talk a little bit about some of your efforts you did in the marketing side and what seemed to work.
Yeah, and this goes back to very early on. We decided in year one that VIA would largely take the lead in marketing. At least they developed materials. They did quite a lot of external marketing for us. We had standard things on our system. We had sandwich boards at stations. We had bus cards and rail cards inside the vehicle. VIA did a number of other things, I think, advertising on web and also in the communities. They also had street teams early on. I think that we thought that those advertising dollars would translate, to additional rides early on. But I think that, this type of service takes some time for folks to get familiar with, to integrate it into their travel patterns. And of course, because it's more of a zone-based system, that familiarity requires an understanding of just where you can take this. So I think there's just at the time, again, going back to 2019, it took a little bit of time for riders to get used to it. And I think that, again, our marketing probably could have been a lot more robust on Metro's side. We felt like our marketing team was just a bit constrained and couldn't provide as much support as we would have needed, whereas VIA's team was just better prepared to take that on. And think, they did a great job. Metro also did a lot of outreach with the communities that were being served by these zones. So making sure that we were talking to the cities, making sure that we were talking to community groups. But yeah, I mean, that said, I think that we anticipated that these marketing activities early on would result in more rides, but what probably resulted in more rides than anything else, again, was the transition during COVID to the point-to-point service. But of course, the service had the benefit of being on the street for a year by that time as it was.
And I want to build on that a little bit with a couple other questions that have come in for you, Anne, related to the fact that from a marketing standpoint, right, the best way to market a service is to have really good service. People take it, and a lot of people took it, and it seems to have really high satisfaction ratings. But as you mentioned, particularly on the point-to-point service, most users didn't take it more than one time. How do we kind of talk about that, right? The fact that people seem to like the service and rate it highly, but then also didn't take it very often.
Well, I think there's potentially two factors going on. One is survey sample bias, right? So that's the researcher side, which is for the rideshare, we only had about 170 responses. For the food delivery, about 100. So it's a really small share of people. And so it could be, and if you think about Yelp, for example, people tend to rate it. They tend to respond and take their time to take a survey when they love something, when they hate something. And so in this case, we had a really positive response. It's hard to know without getting more surveys if this was a subset of people who just love the service, or if it is representative of the broader, sample, the broader population riding the services. On the other hand, I don't think it's all that surprising that people are using these only sometimes. It could be, people have things that come up in life. So it could be that normally they take the same bus to and from the grocery store or to and from work. Maybe they had a late meeting. Maybe they picked up an extra shift at work and they have a later trip, and it no longer, that same schedule doesn't work for them. And so they're using it to kind of fill in the gap, just like we know that people, particularly earning lower incomes, do for Uber and Lyft as well. Kind of fill in that gap in the rest of their travel. In that case, I don't think we'd expect them to use it all the time. And that doesn't necessarily mean they weren't satisfied. But I don't necessarily think we have a clear answer from these. And as any good researcher would say, I think we need more research.
Love it. Question for you, Sean. Shifting gears a little bit. A couple people are asking about the dynamic between the point-to-point and the food delivery service. And kind of on two tracks to talk about this. One, from a user perspective, do we know if there was some kind of cross-marketing or cross-collaboration for folks that use the food delivery service could also encourage to use point-to-point, or vice versa, right? Was there some synergies from a user perspective between the two services? And then from an operational perspective, how difficult was it to coordinate the food deliveries with the passenger portion of this trip, of the service, and how operationally challenging was that?
That's a great question for Via. How operationally challenging it was, because they were undertaking the operations. However, what I can say is, so a couple of distinctions. Packages and riders were not in the same vehicle. So we had a driver that would arrive at a distribution hub and say make 15 or 20 deliveries to households that morning. And then they might go into a rideshare shift following that. So it was separate. And then that overlap really only occurred for about 5 or 6 months. So then when we had the dedicated food service, it was only food deliveries. Another important distinction is that the rideshare service was 3 dedicated zones. They weren't providing rides outside of those zones. And our food delivery zones were actually 14 different dedicated zones that were based on geographies that had already been established by First 5 LA in their Best Start initiative. So there wasn't really necessarily overlap with that either. And then I guess the last distinction is that individual recipients for the food delivery service, they were identified by our nonprofit partners. And so the food delivery service was not something that, say, if you were in a rideshare zone, you could call up for a food delivery. It wasn't, from a restaurant. It was usually from a distribution hub. We were providing that service only for folks who were food insecure in these communities who were Best Start program participants. But I think that, we early on saw a reduction in ridership, and we felt like we had the resources to provide this support to take on food delivery. But as ridership increased, I think, the way that VIA's model works is that it's flexible, and, they're able to increase drivers as they need them, either pulling from their pool or recruiting additional drivers. And so we were able to manage that. And fortunately, we had the operational funds to continue doing that throughout the end until the rideshare service ended. And then I think one of the benefits that we see of multiple use cases is that we actually saw even a further reduction in a cost per ride and cost per delivery basis, because we had these, multiple services happening at one time. And then you could share some of the costs across that. So I think, saw an increase in food delivery costs when it became a dedicated service, because all of the project costs were falling on deliveries, whereas when rideshare and deliveries were happening together, they were offset things like project management fees, back-end fees for software, insurance fees, and that sort of thing.
Very good. It's an interesting dynamic to run two services at one time. So, Anne, this next question's for you, and there's been a few coming in. This is one that I had, and apparently a few others on the phone too, about the cost of the service and how that relates to other services that LA Metro is providing. And I think particularly we're talking about the passenger service. Can you just go in a little bit more detail about how the cost of mobility on demand compared to traditional bus service and some of the other services that LA Metro provides, and kind of how that dynamic plays out at the agency level?
Yeah, well, I'll have to let Sean answer the specific cost of, an average bus line. I think it's tricky because you're not necessarily comparing, every bus line itself, for example, has a different cost. So it depends on really what the comparative metric is. Is it a really heavily utilized bus in downtown LA at peak hour? Is it a bus that's running in more of a suburban neighborhood, in the middle of the night? It really depends what you compare it to. I think when you think about at least the relative utility for people in terms of both the most costly trips for the agency to provide, but also probably what's most valuable to riders, it's probably those late evening trips. Buses aren't as well utilized. They're running on longer headways. On a per passenger basis, they're more expensive to provide. It's also, though, when people probably don't want to be standing outside at night, particularly when we think about safety, gender, and concerns among, waiting at a dark corner. And so I could see a lot of value for individuals there. But in terms of the specific cost and comparison, maybe Sean has a better specific response, but I think it's just a hard piece because you're kind of wondering, what apple do I compare this to? Is it individual route that someone might have taken instead? Is it the service as a, is it the system as a whole? The comparative measure is tricky.
Yeah, and I'm happy to just share. So initially, again, mobility on demand was meant to operate within areas where the existing fixed route service was traditionally very expensive for Metro to serve. So maybe it was expensive on a cost per ride, per boarding basis. It also had low frequency compared to other areas. And we were trying to get folks to the stations that maybe also had really low walkability scores or were just difficult for people to access. We were trying to add this additional option that was safe, that was convenient, that was affordable. And so I think within that lens, the project was effective. Then upon COVID, we saw large increases in the cost of fixed route because ridership had so dramatically reduced. And so during at least the period of COVID, I think that this was very competitive compared to that. And even prior to COVID, it was getting closer to competitiveness with certainly with low performing bus, not quite compared to high performing bus. But I think, again, it depends on, what is it you're trying to accomplish in terms of customer experience. I think this represented a vast improvement compared to certain lines. But yeah, it also comes with a cost, and any agency will need to make that determination on their own whether or not it makes sense for them.
Excellent. So one of the things that we got about 15 minutes left here that we get a lot of questions about here at Eno is from other regions around the country that are considering launching a service like this or are considering changing a service that they may have. Based on some of your findings from particularly year 2 of this pilot, and I'll start with you, Sean, on this, what recommendations would you have for other agencies that are getting into this? What should they be thinking about?
Oh, recommendations for other agencies. That's a great question. I think that, it seems pretty clear that services like on-demand transportation, they're here to stay. More and more agencies are taking them on. There are lots of different use cases for that kind of service. It seems to be providing a solid customer experience. In terms of recommendations, I think that it's critical to stand your ground on the type of data that you want to collect from the pilot, because that is what will help you understand its effectiveness, both from, so a cost perspective, what your riders think of it, how you might be able to make changes. I think we were able to make certain adjustments to the service areas, the fare adjustments, and some of that was driven by responses from ridership early on in the early months of surveys that we were doing. So data is really critical. The other one, though, is, as I mentioned earlier, is just leadership. Certainly we have seen the public transportation industry kind of shift toward these models a little bit more. Going back to 2016, 2017, there was not as much of an appetite for this. And, there was some pushback both internally from Metro to even look at a service like this. But fast forward 6 years later, on-demand rideshare is a permanent service that Metro is offering. But the leadership was critical in that, and recognizing that there might be a new and different way to approach service. And I think that, what MOD demonstrates is at least these new models should be taken seriously. And that also, when you do a pilot, you've got to give it time. You've got to give it time to get people used to the service, to collect the data you need. It takes more than 6 months to run a pilot. It takes more than a year. We were given 2 years. And I think we could have iterated again and made changes, made adjustments, and continued to provide the service. And fortunately, it does, in effect, continue in some form, though a different model with Metro Micro. And they continue to learn more. And I expect that as they continue to run their point-to-point on-demand rideshare service, they will continue to iterate. They will continue to adjust to the needs that are out there in the communities. But I mean, ultimately, what I would say is give it a chance and try it out. You have opportunities probably to utilize it, and your customers, I think, will appreciate it.
Got that. I see a couple thumbs up coming there at the end.
Hey, all right.
Anne, do you have any thoughts or recommendations for other agencies based on your experience working on this?
Yeah, I mean, I'll weigh in from the research side, certainly. And I'm biased. Obviously, I think it's helpful to partner with a research team, mostly because the operations team, so Sean, et cetera, are so busy actually, interfacing with VIA or with the provider and running it, that I think it can be helpful to kind of offload that on someone else. And also people who are routinely asking research questions, doing data analysis, and it's kind of our bread and butter. So we love doing this kind of research. It's applied. It makes us feel useful. And so I'd certainly encourage you to reach out to partner with a research team and then think about what questions you want to answer before starting out. So to Sean's point, and thinking about the data you want to collect, it's the best time to do that is when you're selecting a vendor. I know that going back to the way beginning of this project, LA Metro was considering a different vendor and then ultimately went with VIA based largely on data decisions and what data VIA was willing to provide. I would I would encourage also to, when you're creating a data contract, to discuss the timeline of data delivery. So that was something we've definitely struggled with a bit on the evaluation side, which was delayed data delivery, which is delayed evaluation. Not the end of the world, but something to that I would change if I were to go back and do it again. And then I'd also encourage other agencies to collect data before, so you can really compare, maybe it's trip purpose, maybe it's ridership at a station. We did that with phase 1, and it was really helpful to see, really have a before picture to then understand more of the effect side.
That's great. Yeah, we've found, and I'll echo this in some of the other reports that we've published in conjunction with you all, is the transparency piece, right? It's not just collecting data, but also publishing it, making sure that people can really dive into it. And I see there's a lot of questions about some of the specifics, and we'll be following up with a few of you on those. But one that keeps coming up, right, is the food delivery component, right? The year 2 pilot included this component that both Sean and Ann talked through. It was really delivered food for groceries, right, from food banks to people that were on their identified in their communities. Sean, can you talk a little bit about why you made this decision to partner and deliver food, and does it make sense for an agency to deliver food, right? Because theoretically, you could be taking riders off of your system if you're delivering them food, right? They're not going to have to take the bus there and back, but you're also providing a tremendous benefit, right? How does an agency think about that?
I think we can look at this within the frame of COVID, and absolutely it makes sense. Everything makes sense. When you're a public service provider, you need to provide service, and this presented a unique opportunity for Metro to support the community at a time of crisis that we've not seen in 100 years. So I think the decision for us and our leadership was an easy one to make. Yeah, we had some resources available. Let's serve these communities. So that was easy to make back in March of 2020. And fortunately, we had leadership at the time that was willing to make that. And I think now we're in a different period where we say, okay, we've run this. I've seen some comments in there talking about, well, we need to focus on improving the bus system. And I wholeheartedly agree. And I think that one of the challenges, of continuing service like this is that you do have these costs and benefits. It absolutely is preventing a real benefit in the community for people that have food access issues, people who also have some transportation access issues as well. We know from surveys that we ran with food delivery recipients that many of them did face transportation access issues, and we were, improving food access by providing the service. But, this is also a project that in effect takes dollars away from making those really critical improvements to the bus system as well. And again, it's a cost benefit analysis. And, I think that this type of service kind of shifts the conversation away from talking about availability and more toward accessibility and what mobility means more holistically. Maybe there will be a time at a later date when a transportation agency says, yeah, a food access issue is also a transportation issue, and we want to help to fill that gap. That said, in LA County, there are also a number of other agencies that kind of operate within this similar space that provide transportation for food access or for, other types of use cases. But I think that, Metro would have, liked to continue providing the service, but also recognizing that we have a lot of other improvements that we need to make to our system. And it was better for these funds to be used toward making those improvements to the fixed route rather than continuing on with the food delivery service at this time.
Got it. I think LA Metro, and at least maybe folks in the questions can can correct me, but I think you all were the only ones that were doing this from a public transit agency perspective. I'm not sure if I've heard of any other agency.
I think there
doing it.
were actually quite a few other agencies that were supporting food distribution in different ways. But I think one of the ways in which ours was unique is that we had a dedicated service. I know, for instance, locally Access Services was doing quite a lot of food delivery with their vehicles as well. They saw the reduction in ridership, but they ended that, I think, a year or more ago. And same thing with a lot of the other agencies. I think we stuck with it a lot longer and had the dedicated focus to delivery, in a way that was a little bit different than other agencies.
Great. Looking at the time, we just have a few more minutes left. And the one question that's come up a lot is the future of the pilot, right? And this is not a session where we're explicitly talking about the future of mod and Metro Micro, but maybe Sean, if you could just spend a few minutes addressing that, talking about how the services, mobility on demand service is effectively over and it's transitioned to this Metro Micro. What does that look like? Just kind of give a brief overview of that, and maybe we can have a further conversation here about that in a couple months.
Sure, and I'm going to go back all the way to ancient history because I'll be remiss if I don't get some thank yous out of the way, here at the end. But I think I would just want to thank, the Metro team that had the foresight way back when to go after this grant. And so that includes people like our former Chief Innovation Officer, Joshua Schenk, Emma Huang, Marie Sullivan, Avital Shavit, Metro Grants team, and also the Metro Micro team, which when Mobility on Demand came to an end, they so graciously received our mod zones and continue to provide on-demand service in these areas, as well as 5 other zones across the county. That program launched, I think, in December of 2020. It's an excellent service. It operates with shared vehicles. I think the vans are 10 to 14 passenger vans. The drivers, it's a little bit different model. They're actually Metro employees. So it's been, I think, really fantastic, has already served hundreds of thousands of rides across the county and has been a great service. But, that said, I also want to thank the VIA team, Yael and Ari and Krista and George and Imran and Todd and Alex. They've been awesome. And of course, you, Paul, and Michael Manville and Alexandra Weber, who have been really great partners throughout this research work. And then I also want to thank one of the unsung heroes as well, Steve Mortensen at FTA, who is just such a fantastic and supportive person throughout the grant life cycle. But, I think all of the work of all of these people have now resulted in the fact that, again, on-demand service is a permanent service at Metro Micro. At Metro, and it continues through the form of Metro Micro, which again is, it's a project that started in a different place than mod. It's not a continuation of mod. It started from the very beginning as a micro transit service providing point-to-point rides across these areas. But again, I think, the future is that micro will continue. It will continue to iterate. I think every day new agencies continuing to offer on-demand rideshare services that are improving the customer experience for their riders. They're increasing access to destinations that we all need. And I think that we will continue to see them integrate into the system. Another important guiding principle was that this was about integrating with the transit system, complementing it, not taking rides away from it. How do we generate additional rides for that system? And I think that, we see that it seems to be working. But I also want to give Anna opportunity to give her thoughts as well about what the future of this looks like too.
I mean, Sean, I think you said it all. You're the expert on the inside, so okay. I think it's fine to leave it with your points.
All right.
Yeah. And just to, Sean, you corrected me about some of the other agencies that were doing food delivery pilots during COVID, and several folks in the questions also mentioned a couple of different agencies that are doing that. So my fault on getting that stat a little bit wrong, but glad to see other agencies are trying these kind of things. We definitely want to stay engaged on this issue. not only with you, Sean and Anne, but also for everyone that's on the phone. We are out of time now, but if you do have follow-up questions, if you have specifics about this program, about some of the things that we found in our research, don't hesitate to reach out to me or to others on the phone, and we'll get to those questions right away. So again, thank you, Anne. Thank you, Sean, for sharing your expertise and your insights, and we hope to continue the conversation soon.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you, Anne. Thanks, everybody out there.